Hi, it's Alexander Russo with The Grade, and this is the Education Show. I'm excited to be here with Matt Drange to talk about his latest investigations. The topic is a difficult one: school sexual assault, school predators. But it's an important one, and Matt has done enormous work to bring it to light. Matt, thanks for being on the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself for people who don't know you as well as I do.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Alexander. Yeah, my name is Matt Drange. I'm an investigative reporter based here in California. I most recently worked for Business Insider for about 5 years until a few months ago. And a lot of the reporting, most of the reporting that I've done on this issue was for BI. And Yeah, I'm a freelance reporter now. I'm working on a variety of topics, but I've covered specifically educator sexual misconduct within the education beat for, I guess, about 5 years now.
I know your work well, and I'm a big admirer. As you know, I hadn't seen your byline on this topic for a little while, so I was really happy to see, if one can be happy to see a story on school sexual assault. I was really happy to see you in Cal Matters. Can you tell, for the folks who haven't seen it yet, can you give a two-sentence summary of what is in the latest Cal Matters story that you put out?
Sure. Yeah, so I have a story in Cal Matters up this week about a new bill in California called SB 848, which is actually heading for a vote, I believe, today on the Assembly floor. It's already passed the Senate. And essentially, in a nutshell, what the bill would do is bring California up to speed with many other states with regards to pass the trash. California lacks comprehensive pass the trash laws, and this bill would go a long way to changing that.
So, for people who don't know, pass the trash is when a district passes a teacher or an educator or staff member who's been accused of something on to another district where that person is probably going to do the same thing. I saw in the story that people usually go from one place to another 3 times before they're caught in some form. I saw in the story that 1 out of 10 kids experiences some sort of sexual predation, and also that the estimated cost just for California paying out the survivors of these awful experiences is something like $3 billion. This is not a small or infrequent situation, is it?
Not at all. And I think that's what has a lot of attention from lawmakers here in the state is that financial aspect. It's been a steady drumbeat of stories on this area for many, many years, as some folks know, but it is sadly a lot more common, I think, than most people realize. And so in California, a law that was passed a few years ago, AB 218, opened the door for a lot more lawsuits by survivors. And that $3 billion figure is an estimate of the financial toll that those lawsuits have had on school districts across the state, which of course is enormous and has insurance implications and all sorts of other things.
This issue is personal to me for a bunch of reasons. First of all, the idea of kids being groomed or raped by school staff is just a horrible one. Seems like a wildly unreported story to me. And also, I personally went to a school where there was some behavior that was being overlooked by faculty and by kids. And there was a couple moments where the drama teacher, who was my favorite teacher, asked me to do some things that now seem like grooming behavior. Is this personal to you in the same way as it is to me? I feel like it must be.
Well, it's personal to me, in the sense that I started reporting on this issue on educators grooming students for sexual relationships at my own high school. And 3 years ago now, I published a story with Business Insider about my own high school journalism teacher. Of course, I'm a journalist, and so that is certainly personal. I mean, this educator's class was my introduction to my profession. I've been a reporter since I was 17 years old in his classroom. So it is certainly personal to me. And I did not realize too at that time that publishing that story about one teacher would lead to publishing a story about my alma mater and dozens of teachers, which is what spurred this legislation that we can talk about. But then also a nationwide story as well about this behavior at more than 500 school districts across the country. The reality is that almost everyone's school has teachers who have been accused of sexual misconduct. It's just in many cases they may not know that.
What's it like for you personally, professionally, reporting on your old school, reporting on an experience that you witnessed directly or indirectly, I should say, and apparently continued for years after you were there?
Yeah, for me, it's been very powerful. It's deeply upsetting. I mean, I've met and gotten to know a lot of people who I grew up with a lot better through this process. So, in some ways, it's been nice to feel more connected to home, but overall, it's of course been difficult to report on. I think one thing that I've been trying to figure out for a long time now is just how unusual my school is or is not. And I'm starting to think at this point that I don't actually think my high school, with at this point about 24 known um, educators who committed sexual misconduct of some kind, ranging from sexual harassment all the way to statutory rape. I don't actually think my school is that unusual. I think it's just that because of my connection to the school, because I am an alumni, I do have an enormous amount of trust in that community to tell their story, and so I think I have better access to it than most journalists do when reporting on school sexual abuse in a K-12 setting. And so I think I've been able to uncover a bit more than is normally uncovered, but I don't actually think it's that unusual. And this entire subject, I mean, and this school, my high school, is the subject of a book I'm working on now, actually, and I'm going to be diving into that and a lot of the issues in the story this week too, about some of the historical opposition to pass the trash laws, and to unpack those as well.
I have to be honest with you. I read and wrote about your stories and other related stories in a very eager way for a while. I did a bunch of interviews with experts, some of whom you cite in your stories. And then about a year ago, I gave up. I grew sort of despondent on this topic. No amount of coverage, yours and others, no amount of expert research seemed to turn the tide. And every week I follow the education news every week, and every week there's a story, and it's rarely the person's first time, and the trauma and upset that comes from these situations. It's just the worst topic. It's just the worst topic. How have you kept going, or have you taken breaks and then come back to this? Because it's just awful to work on.
Yeah, I mean, it's I do know what you mean, Alexander. I think a lot of people have been working a long time fruitlessly to kind of raise the alarm bell as far as how frequent this abuse is. I think for many people, um, they actually have a connection to it in their life somehow. They know someone who was groomed by an educator, for example. Statistically, almost all of us do. It's just that they don't know it, and they don't feel like they can sort of grasp how immediate that is. And so I think as a result, a lot of people think, well, yeah, of course this does happen, but it's not that common. It's maybe one teacher at this school, maybe one teacher at that school. They don't think that there are probably multiple teachers at every school. Um, but the flip side of that for me personally as an investigative reporter is that there's just more stakes, and that's what I've used to sort of drive me to continue to report on this. I mean, it's so common, here in California, similar bills to SB 848 have been introduced in the past and been shot down. And I just think that sometimes with reporting, it's in a lot of different contexts, not just this one. The most difficult problems tend to take the longest to solve, and I do think there are, from speaking with experts, there is a lot of kind of low hanging fruit that can be done to fix grooming in schools, but I also think there are a lot of facets of this issue that are quite difficult to solve. Relying on mandated reporting, which I think a lot of the educators who are mandated reporters don't actually know exactly what that means. They don't have enough training. Administrators who aren't equipped to conduct investigations or don't have the funding to do that. They don't have the resources to do that. I just think there are a lot of problems that will take a long time, and then there are some policy fixes that are being worked on and other states have adopted. But it's certainly a tricky problem to fix, I think, and one with obviously big implications.
One of the things that's different in 2025 than in the recent past is the politics are different, and also the trust in the education system is different, right? Trust in the education system is low. Um, Critics of public school systems are on this topic, um, uh, raising concerns about student safety in schools. And yet there are these 16 states. I'm presuming that they're all blue states that don't have these mandatory reporting and disclosure laws. Do you think anything's different in California or anywhere else in 2025 than it is in the past?
I'm not sure that the this moment, with the federal education department and our federal administration has had that much bearing here in California. I can't speak to other states. I haven't followed recently some of the developments there, but at least here in California, I think the difference is more so this financial aspect. So SB 848 draws on a lot of relatively new data from a very small agency that no one has ever heard of called FICMAT in California that is focused entirely on risk management from a financial standpoint. And in January of this year, that agency produced a report, which is where the $3 billion liability figure is from. And I think that just floored a lot of people. I think like this bill, for example, SB 848, actually has a lot of support from Republicans. It has bipartisan support, and a lot of the lawmakers who are on the fence about it, as I understand it, many of them are supported by the very teachers unions who are opposing it. So the California Federation of Teachers and the CSEA, which represents a lot of non-credentialed staff, coaches, other paraprofessionals, are the two kind of leading unions opposing it. I think the Teamsters are involved now in opposing as well. And so I do think you have this interesting dynamic at a local level of, historically big labor unions have supported Democrats, right? And that's kind of been their party. And so now you have, in this case, a Democratic senator introducing this bill that may go against the interests of the very unions that help support other Democrats. So I do think there's a lot of tension there.
Right. It's worth noting that at the national level, for example, the Teamsters didn't endorse in the 2024 presidential. Your story reports that the California Teachers Association is taking a no position on this bill, or are they for it?
They don't have any opposition, so I don't think they're not formally they don't have a position. Yeah, they're not formally supporting it. And I do think it's noteworthy though in the past that the CTA, our biggest teachers union here in California, has opposed legislation on Pass the Trash. I think one of the key distinctions with SB 848 is that the disciplinary database that it would create, which essentially would be a database that's only accessible to other school districts. It wouldn't be public in the way that, let's say, you could look up someone's credential. This is a database just for hiring purposes. That if a non-teacher, so a coach, for example, is being investigated for some sort of egregious, quote unquote, misconduct, they would get on this database. And so it's a level of accountability that already exists here for credentialed teachers, but does not for non-credentialed staff, which is a lot of employees. And I think also it's worth pointing out, research shows that grooming, the sort of best, I'm using best in air quotes here, situation, or most common situation, I should say, is after school one-on-one time with students. So that's where a lot of grooming happens. And so a lot of these non-credentialed staff are doing that exact work. And so I think the CTA, has no official position that I know of on this bill. I think partly because a lot of the focus and the concern over the due process is around this database that would affect non-credentialed employees.
So there's already a database for credentialed employees in California, or this law doesn't try to create such a thing?
This law does not try to create such a thing. I think a version of it, I don't think it's as extensive, but does exist for credentialed teachers in California, yes. Not to say that has prevented passing the trash. I think like one of the cases I highlight in the story actually is about a former choir director who was on staff at my high school, Rosemead High, went on to teach at a school down the street after he was investigated for a sexual relationship with a former student. And then was put on leave at that school and just recently signed a resignation, or excuse me, a separation agreement with that school. But that includes the same non-disclosure clauses that we see all the time. And so he, in theory, could then go work somewhere else and be able to get a job elsewhere.
One of the things that drives me crazy is that things that are tragic and rare, school shootings are an example, get so much coverage, relatively speaking, and things that are tragic and nearly ubiquitous, according to me reading your stories, gets much less attention. Do you have any thoughts about why there's this disparity in attention between two comparably horrible things, terrifying things?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, I think like I said, there's a lot behind grooming in schools. There are a lot of reasons why it's underreported. A school shooting, of course, is a very obvious event. It happens in real time. Social media, things are flying around. Of course, parents are rightfully terrified. Um, and you have loss of life in some cases, unfortunately. So all of those things, in any journalistic context, are going to get immediate attention from a breaking news standpoint. I think the grooming behavior, there are a lot of things that make it hard to report on, frankly. I mean, number one, in most states, grooming in and of itself is not a crime. It's also, in many cases, like hard to define or hard to um, punish, right? Giving a student a ride home, showering them with gifts, like those things likely violate district policy, but you're not going to have a prosecutor investigating that unless it leads to a sexual relationship. And not all of those cases do. In fact, many do not. You also have the fact that, at this point, I think I've talked to over 100 survivors at my school and elsewhere, and so many of them feel this sense of shame and they feel complicit in what happened to them. They're very unlikely to come forward. I think the average age of a survivor of this kind of abuse who comes forward is about 40 years old. Um, when it happens to them when they're 15, 16, 17 years old. So that I think is working against us. You have school districts who do, by and large, a pretty terrible job, frankly, of investigating this kind of behavior. So there often aren't as many documents as there should be generated. So that is holding reporting back. Here in California, the CTC is essentially a black box. They're exempted from a lot of what the Public Records Act gives us access to at the local level.
This
I
is the
cannot
California
see.
teaching credential for people who don't know.
Yes, yeah, our state
California
credentialing
Teaching
agency.
Commission, right? Right.
Yeah, California Teacher Credentialing Commission, I believe. Yeah,
We'll get it right.
yeah.
How would you describe, a couple years ago, if I recall correctly, you sent out an invitation to other journalists who might be interested in this topic and said, hey, let's sort of crowdsource. Here's what I know. What was the response initially, and what has happened to that crew that you assembled?
Yeah. So for context, for anyone who doesn't know, so back in late 2023, I published a story at Business Insider based on a very large cache of public records that I collected from about 550 school districts across the country, using the very public records laws that I was just talking about. And it was a lot of information, tens of thousands of pages of teacher disciplinary records, almost all of which were focused on sexual misconduct and abuse. And I did a story on that, and I probably cited or used in the story 5% of that information. And so I told my editors, obviously we cited broad statistics. We created our own database of the types of misconduct and what happened. So we used all the information, but we didn't cite specific cases. And I knew there was so much there that should be reported directly in a local way that we couldn't. So I mentioned that to my editors, and we put out a call out for any education reporter in the country who was interested to sign up, and I could share the disciplinary documents that I collected in their area. And so we did that with, I want to say in the end, there were about 70 or 80 education reporters who signed up. And I think, I can't remember how many stories were done, a handful of stories, maybe 5 to 10 stories out of San Diego, Oregon, I think New Jersey and elsewhere, um, were done based on those documents. I think there are still some stories in the works. Again, like I was just talking about before, this is a really difficult subject to report on. The documents are a start, but it will take more legwork than just that. But we did see, I think, a lot of reporters interested in this subject, and hoping that that spurs future reporting as well and future records requests so that they could go deeper.
Do you get a sense of discomfort uh, from journalists about this topic? It's a difficult topic.
I think there's a sense of discomfort from everyone, including journalists, with regards to child sexual abuse. I mean, it's something that I've talked about with agents recently for my book. I mean, it's a very difficult subject to write about because it's a difficult subject to convince someone to pick up and read, as you were talking about at the top. So I think journalists are certainly not exempt from that. I think I think what is tricky from a reporting standpoint, again, is sort of some of those things are less black and white. This is an issue that tends to be reported locally when there is law enforcement involvement. Right. When there's law enforcement involvement, someone is arrested. Right. That's a very easy thing to report on. Someone is charged with a crime. That's a very easy, straightforward thing to report on. The issue is that the vast majority of grooming in schools never leads to local law enforcement. It either isn't properly investigated, or if law enforcement does investigate, because of the grayness, because of the lack of records, because the student won't cooperate, because the student is defending the teacher, all sorts of reasons, it becomes a lot trickier to report on from a liability standpoint. I've been fortunate to work with publications like Cal Matters, where we named two teachers in this story who, as far as I know, have not been accused of any crime. But at many publications, I think there is a hesitancy to do that because they're worried, well, did this teacher really do this, and how do we know? And so I think it's less of in my view, it's less of a concern about the topic and more about the uncertainty and lack of official findings in many cases.
Well, let's talk about that for just a second. You're saying that you're naming teachers who haven't been accused of a crime, but you're obviously not naming them based on nothing. How do you find your way to be able to name a teacher who hasn't been accused, much less convicted of a crime in a story?
Well, for me, I mean, it's all about the reporting underneath it, right? Which is, in my case, vast. I mean, the two teachers that we named in the story this week, both of whom I've reported on for years. In both cases, I actually sued my high school for violating the California Public Records Act with my attorney, a guy named Felix Tinkoff out of San Diego. And he was able to, after we filed the lawsuit, we were able to get a big stack of records almost immediately, in fact. And we had a settlement later where they did further searching for records. And so in these two cases, the teachers that we named in my recent story, I have disciplinary documents for. I have the district's investigation, which in one case was actually pretty extensive. It was unusual in that sense. Most aren't that extensive. I have a copy of the settlement agreement. I have a copy of the police investigation. In one case, the other teacher was investigated. He was not charged with a crime, but he was investigated twice by two different local law enforcement agencies. And so I have those records. I've also talked to the students who those teachers abuse, whose names never appear in the documents, but who I have through other reporting. So there's a whole big universe of reporting behind that. But if you just have the document, if you just have the settlement agreement, you're not going to have any of that context, right? And so I think that it's a good example, I think, of just, to your point, Alexander, like why it's hard to report on is that, a lot of these other reporters who, I might give a head start by sharing records with, that's really just the start. It takes a lot more reporting.
The issue doesn't seem likely to go away. I had the chance to interview an actor who was in the Broadway show. John Proctor is the villain. His name's Gabriel Ebert. He plays the cool teacher. You find out a lot more about him during the run of the show. They're turning that into a movie. Is there a national organization that tracks this and publicizes this, sort of every town for school sexual assault? Is there a Jonathan Haidt for school sexual assault? Where are the champions and the resources that you would go to, or you would suggest other people to go to?
There are a number of nonprofit organizations looking into this. Mass Kids is one based in Massachusetts that I'm aware of that has data and essentially a report card, for lack of a better term, on every state's pass the trash legislation. They're actively pushing for more legislation in that area. Um, There also, I know have interviewed some of the leading experts in this field. There are also a lot of independent academic experts. Charles Shakeshaft, Billy Joe Grant, who I quoted in my story this week. There are a number of experts like that, and then other organizations like Sesame, which I'm going to try to remember the acronym. I think it's Stop. It's sexual abuse and misconduct in education. I think I'm forgetting the second word there. That Billy Joe Grant is part of, and Terry Miller. There are a number of organizations, probably many others that I'm forgetting, that are doing work in this space. But as you said earlier, it's the long fight. Many of these organizations have been trying to do this or doing this work for years, and it's just
Right.
one of those sticky situations. I liken it actually to gun violence. I mean, I think if any viewers are familiar with the argument, I was just talking to a consultant in Sacramento about SB 848 this week, and this came up in my conversation with him, and I said, this concern over due process that the opposition to this bill, SB 848, has, it kind of reminds me of the argument in gun violence of the good guy with a gun, which essentially comes down to, well, we should have concealed carry permits and make gun access easy for everyone, because if there's a crime happening, let's say at our grocery store, if there's a good guy with a gun there, he can stop that crime. That's essentially the argument. And if he doesn't have that gun, then he won't stop the crime, and law enforcement won't get there in time, and the crime will be carried out. Those cases do happen. They're also incredibly, incredibly rare. And so, in this context, in the education context, it seems very much analogous to me, where the concern over due process is, well, did this teacher really do it? Did this coach really groom the student for a sexual relationship? And would they be wrongfully accused? And teachers are wrongfully accused. I mean, breaking news, kids lie, right? Teenagers lie, as any parent would be shocked to know. That does happen. Does that lead to serious consequences for that teacher? Occasionally. There's also no data that I'm aware of on that. I've been asking everyone that question for years. And as best I can tell, the frequency with which that happens is significantly outnumbered by the number of victims of educator sexual misconduct. So that, to me, I think, is, if anybody is familiar with the gun debate, I think something to think about.
So the thing that seems like it might be make things different in the fall that we're in now and next year is the rise of conservative influencers' interest in this issue. The person I know best, you may know the name of Corey DeAngelis. Corey DeAngelis has followers coming out of his ears, and whenever he finds an incident along these lines, he does not have the compunctions that you or another journalist might have in publicizing what's publicly available. I don't think he's doxing people. They might disagree, but he's certainly on the topic, and safety and school safety can't help but be important issues to parents and the public and journalists. I'm happy to know that you're working on, or at the beginning of working on, a book. What else is happening next on this topic?
That's my primary focus, is this book. I'm continuing to monitor the bill in Sacramento. I am familiar with some of that increase in awareness, particularly on social media, and have noticed and have gotten reader feedback too, along the lines of, hey, from a concerned parent, how can I request records on my kid's teacher? I've gotten a lot of emails like that, and so I do think there's a lot of interest in increased transparency on this, which I think is a good thing. And it is perhaps maybe some odd bedfellows in a sense, politically, but if that leads to educational environments that are safer for kids, then I think that's probably a net positive.
Right. On that topic, I just got to ask, the topic of parents' rights has been a big one in the last couple of years, means all sorts of things to all sorts of different people. Are there laws or proposals that allow individual parents to to seek employee records, non-criminal employee records that exist?
Not that I'm aware of. Typically, what happens in those situations is the parent uses their state, or in some cases local, like in San Francisco, we have a local public records law that anybody could use. I'm not familiar with any laws specific on parents in the way that, at least here in California, and I know elsewhere, there's a lot of talk and legislation around, transgender children and giving parents alerts on that. I don't know if there's like a similar analogy with disciplinary records. No, I think it focuses on public records, which are, I should say, are notoriously fraught with loopholes. Like I mentioned earlier, I had to sue my own high school for access to these documents that are plainly public, and that I ultimately got. But how many people are going to file a lawsuit? How many parents are going to do that? Probably not very many. So it's not a great avenue, but it's the only one that I'm aware of.
Excellent. Well, listen, I could ask you 100 questions, but then we'd all be very, very tired. This has been amazing and interesting and useful to talk to you about this. I really appreciate you taking the time. And we'll be looking out for your book and whenever it happens.